So it is 12 p.m. and again, I'm sure that the assessor will be joining us any minute. I'd like to welcome you to our October member meeting and to provide a few organizational updates. As you may recall from our previous meetings, the Chicago Central Area Committee was contacted by the Chicago Department of Planning and Development, and we worked with DPD very closely on the first round of RFPs that were released at the end of August for the Invest Southwest program. We were very honored when DPD came back to us and asked CCAC to be involved with round 2. These are, we're actually drafting the RFPs, doing market analysis, providing renderings, and we expect that these are going to have a significant transformational change in these communities. If you would be interested in participating in the future, please send me an email. I suspect that there will be opportunities moving forward until all of the Invest Southwest neighborhoods are completed. So please email me if you would like to be involved. I'd also like to make you aware that our Burnham Council is in the process of organizing programming for December. So it doesn't look like we'll be able to have our annual December holiday in-person meeting unless something drastically changes in a positive way in the next 60 days. So we are going to focus on downtown and the future of downtown, our recovery, and coming back better. So that's going to be our December programming, and we are just in the process now of organizing that. If you'd like to be involved, again, please send me an email. I want to also remind you that we're continuing to do our webinar series, generally twice a week. We have upcoming speakers like Andy Zopp from World Business Chicago, Brad Henderson from P33, the Chancellor of Purdue, Northwest Indiana, and this leads to our big summit, which is going to be the week of November 16th. All of the CCAC members are on the guest list, and I'll have more information for you. Watch your email. So with those updates, finally, I am finished with that and I can greet our speaker. Hello, Assessor. How are you today?
Hi, Kelly. Good to have you. Good. Glad everyone's here. Good to see you again.
Yeah, well, we really appreciate you coming back and joining us. As I mentioned in our prep call, I know our members really appreciate the opportunity to hear from you about your office and to get their questions answered. So although I think that this is probably unnecessary but for the sake of protocol, I will provide a brief introduction. And for our members, we're very fortunate today to have Cook County Assessor Fritz Kaegi. And he began his career in Cook County government in 2018 after spending more than 20 years valuing assets as a mutual fund portfolio manager and analyst. Since assuming office, he has brought fairness, ethics, and transparency to Cook County Assessor's Office with a vision focused on operational changes, technological upgrades, and the elimination of favoritism. Highlights of his early years in office include the public release of all assessment modeling code and data, an external audit by the IAAO, the passage of law that makes senior exemptions renew automatically. I know my father is grateful for that on a personal note. The modernization of online exemptions and appeal filings, and a new collaborative approach to property valuations to increase predictability and spur investment in Chicago and Cook County. And obviously, Assessor, as I just mentioned, you know, the organization has been focused on working in the neighborhoods for the last few years. Downtown was so vibrant and robust. And after COVID and the economic downturn and the riots and looting, we recognize that we need to have simultaneous paths and continue to look at Chicago's recovery and making sure that the city as a whole and certainly the county, you know, we have our sister organization that focuses on the mega region, including the Chicagoland area. So I'm sure we're very, very interested to hear on how your office is dealing with these drastic changes in such a quick time frame. But before we get to all of that, on a personal note, let me ask, how are you and your family, and how have you been through this COVID crisis?
Well, thanks for asking, Kelly. I'm coming to you from Oak Park, where I live. I grew up in Hyde Park on the south side, but I've been here for about 10 years. You know, it's kind of fun to be in my library, but, you know, if you hear a doorbell ring or a dog bark, or you see a child come in here asking for help, it's a really great reminder about how being downtown makes us all more productive. You know, I miss out on the chance of seeing all of you personally, which has always been so great. You know, when we came back, when we spoke with you last September 19th, we got so much good input, so much good insight that really helped us to succeed with other things like our Analyst Day last year. And so I'm happy to be here at home, feeling blessed, but missing all of the great things about being downtown, where we can all meet new people and develop new things and contacts and be more productive.
Exactly. Well, and right back at you, you know, I live in fear of the dog barking and the doorbell ringing, but everybody I think is very understanding. There's very few, I think, on this call that, you know, don't have the same exact problems. So I know that you have some remarks that you want to share, kind of updating us, and I am going to go off camera to allow you to provide those updates, and then I will come back and open it up to our members to ask questions. How does that sound?
Well, great. Sounds perfect, Kelly. And I wanted to thank you and the Central Area for the opportunity to be here, for everyone who's attending, for all that you're doing to build and grow Chicago and make it better.
Thank you.
A place that we all love and care about.
I appreciate that.
So first of all, I'd just like to talk a little bit about what we did in the office itself to react to COVID. Then let's talk about how we are taking into account COVID in the assessment process, which I know is so gravely important to everyone. And then we'll also talk about the sales ratio study that was just released, which provides insight to us on the state of assessments pre-COVID in the city of Chicago specifically, which we did not do. It was done by the Barrios administration. It kind of informs how we think about making adjustments for COVID before we reassess the city of Chicago next year. And then we'll talk about some of the solutions that we've been working on to make our office, our workings, work better, to properly reform it. And then we get to the fun part, which is your questions. We'll make sure we leave plenty of time for that. So first, you know, we came into this year really chomping at the bit because we had just introduced several new tech platforms into our office in the first quarter. So in January, February, we introduced several technological platforms that on their own were really huge in terms of providing better service to you. So first of all, we put into place online commercial appeals. Those had never been there before. We put into place the ability to get exemptions online by putting a DocuSign platform in. We put into place a whole new call center. We'd never been able to track basic call center metrics before, and we put into place call center technology, which gave us the opportunity to do a virtual call center too. We created a whole new website with several different tools to serve you better, to serve all the many different demands that we have on the office better. And we created a commercial data platform, the Real Property Income in Expense form, which allows us to intake data before the assessment process starts to serve you better. And we had all that place, and boy, were we lucky, because when COVID hit, we had sort of the bones of being able to operate remotely that we would not have been able to. That combined with the legislation passed that allowed for automatic renewal of the senior exemption, allowed us to do a lot remotely that used to be paper-based. Imagine taking all your appeals in paper, taking all your senior exemptions, hundreds of thousands of pieces of paper, tens of thousands of people coming into our office. We didn't have to do any of that. Boy, were we lucky. We shut down the office in mid-March. We went to working remotely. We paused sending out assessments. We just started sending out assessments based on pre-COVID, our pre-COVID valuation opinion. And we took a pause because we knew how cataclysmic the impact of COVID was, and our property tax code has a section that allows us to take account for natural disasters. And President Trump and Governor Pritzker declared the onset of COVID a natural disaster. So that allowed us to take into account the effects of COVID in our assessments this year. And we were faced with a choice: do we continue to send out assessments based on pre-COVID state of the world, or do we do our best to send out assessments based on the state of the world that we had it with COVID? And we decided to do it with COVID because we thought we had enough information to do it with. We knew it wouldn't be perfect. It's not the ideal set of information, but it was good enough, and it would be better than doing nothing, especially since if we did nothing, some people would still have the ability through the appeals process, many different appeals processes, to take into account COVID, but the majority of people who don't appeal would not have benefited from that. And that would build inequity in the system, push more burden onto the people who were not appealing from the people who did in an incomplete manner. We said, we have the data to do this, let's do it for everyone. And so that was the big policy decision that we made. And then we started resuming sending out assessments with the COVID effect. So all the assessments that we're doing in the south suburbs this year, in the west suburbs, incorporate the effect of COVID in them. And then in the areas that are not being reassessed this year, Chicago and the north suburbs, we'll make an adjustment for COVID so that we're keeping the system equitable, and we'll adjust it where merited. So where the starting point of the assessment seems like a reduction in the valuation is called for. So that's that was the basic policy decision that we faced when we were hit in March. The other thing that we did when COVID hit is we worked with the county board and our county treasurer to have passed a suspension in late fees for property taxes paid. The property taxes were still due for the second half bill in August, but late fees that the treasurer adds to the bills that are unpaid would have typically accrued starting after August, but we got passed, thanks to the initiative of the treasurer's office and the county commissioners, the late fees would only start to accrue on October 1st. And that could provide a measure of relief in addition to our taking on the impact of COVID in our assessments this year. I'd like to note that we're the first jurisdiction in the US to take on, assessment jurisdiction in the US to take on COVID in our work. Just about everyone is kicking it to next year. You know, just because something's hard doesn't mean you don't do it. And I think the next thing we'll talk about is, how did we do it? You know, a lot of people were saying you don't have enough transactions. So how can you take into account the effect of COVID in your assessments? And let's talk about that now. First of all, you know, we didn't go into this with an end result in mind. We used a data-based approach to understand the impacts of COVID. And when it comes to both residential and commercial properties, we had several different data sets to draw from. First of all, we had public markets. Every day there's a real-time assessment of value being done on many different classes of property by public markets, which can tell us the impact of COVID on those subclasses. That gives us an indication of value. It's not a perfect indication of value, but it's a pretty good indication in terms of magnitude and also comparison, because public markets are telling us some of the same things that models and our intuition also tell us. On the residential side, we looked at, first of all, we have public markets and single family house rates. And that gave us one indication of what the public market is saying the impact of COVID was on the value of single family homes nationwide. So it's not just Chicago, but it is saying across a wide portfolio of properties, there was the impact. We also looked at the impact of, we used the unemployment models that our federal regulators use on the residential side to get an indication of what the distribution of impact of COVID might be on different kinds of classes of residential property in neighborhoods. Our federal regulatory authorities, they have to supervise the capitalization of our banking system. And to do this, they have to come up with an assessment of impact of different economic factors on house values, because that indicates whether the loan books of our banking system are likely to go into foreclosure or not. And we talked closely to federal regulators on different indications of how to gauge unemployment with house values. And we did that in combination with really great granular data sets that the Urban Institute has on employment structure in different neighborhoods and how COVID was affecting different classes of employment. And so then we could map that effect onto different neighborhoods depending on the employment structure in those neighborhoods. And that was giving us sort of the same kind of magnitudes that the public markets were, so confirming each other. We talked to market participants, so brokers, people who are in the market right now, to get a sense of where activity was. Unfortunately, there's a lag in actual transactions being reported to us, but we could get a sense from talking to market participants where transactions were going, how asking values were changing, where bargaining power seemed to be changing. And then we could also talk to academic and policy experts who looked at past cycles to get an indication. So on the residential side, we had a fair amount of data, and it ended up pointing to a single family reduction of somewhere between 8 and 12%, depending on the employment structure in the neighborhoods that we were looking at. And we've publicly written about all the data sources that we use. It's there for everyone to see. We published a whole document on all the public market impacts that we saw. So that's on the residential side. On the commercial side, again, public markets actually, or normally we have much richer transaction data on the residential side than the commercial side. The interesting thing about COVID is it sort of flipped things, because COVID happened so fast and because there's a lag in reporting transaction data. We had less data to go with on the single family residential side, but we had more to go with on commercial, because there are so many different publicly traded indications of value in different classes of commercial property. So in the equity markets, publicly traded REITs, there are REITs for office, there are REITs for multifamily, there are REITs for different classes of retail, there are REITs for warehouse, there are REITs for personal storage, REITs for gas stations, REITs for performance spaces. And again, these are national portfolios, so it's not a perfect read across to Chicago, but the pre-COVID state of all these publicly traded vehicles versus their post-COVID state can give us an indication of what the magnitude of impact is and the severity of impact. The public market was saying the greatest impacts are on lodging and retail. The public markets were saying pretty much no impact on things like data centers and lab space, very little impact on warehouses, more impact, a little bit more impact on multifamily, more impact on that on office. And that, I think that feeds not only the intuition, but also the pattern of data that we've seen coming after that. Another piece of data that we had was the public bond markets. The commercial mortgage-backed security market is an important indicator, because we could see which mortgages are going into default or non-payment or a special servicing status. And that gives us an indication of financial stress. It won't come as a surprise to anyone on this call that the public bond markets were telling us that lodging and retail were the most impacted by COVID. We saw a spike in delinquency rates on commercial mortgages and retail and lodging that was very dramatic. We did not see much impact on delinquency rates in multifamily, in office, or warehouse. So that was an interesting bifurcation. I think the thing that was also interesting out of that was that although there was not much change in office and multifamily mortgages, so practically no change in delinquency rates. Nonetheless, public markets were marking down values. So what is that saying? And I think one of the things it was saying is that going forward, rents will be lower, occupancy will be lower for these kinds of properties, but the leases in place will be money good. We have to think about at the assessor's office what the indication of value is rather than leases today. Leases today you might not be able to sign leases on the same terms today that were signed a couple of years ago. So that indication of value is very important to us. We also talked to, on the commercial side, the Appraisal Institute to get a sense from an appraisal point of view, the impacts of COVID. That gave us a sense of what kinds of spreads could be added into cap rates, depending on the asset class, what it hit to leasing terms could be expected, to occupancy could be expected. That basically reinforced what we were seeing from the public side. And then, of course, we also looked at past experience on the commercial side to see what had happened before. And of course, we looked at the factors that that all of us are looking at to do our own work. And basically, I think what we saw is, on the commercial side, is, I don't want to seem trite here, this will probably be reinforcing a lot of the things that you see. After all, we're just trying to capture what's going on in public markets. You know, we expected lower apartment rent collections, and we expected lower retail rent collections as well. We expected a collapse in hotel occupancy rates and a slow recovery in them. Probably hotel, lodging would probably see a slower recovery than many other classes, because if you think about what drives lodging, first, when we reopen, whenever that happens, have local activity increasing, but it's going to take longer for people to get on airplanes, for people to go to conferences, for people to travel internationally. Many countries won't allow people who've been in the United States to come back to their countries. And so this is, we saw the greatest hit in the hotel spaces. We also saw, we saw that restaurants and public entertainment venues would be under pressure for an extended period of time, basically for the same reason. The public entertainment venues in particular are really caught in a very difficult spot by COVID. As I mentioned, some classes of property doing better. The ones that can house supermarkets and drugstores, pretty much robust activity through COVID. Warehouses, particularly newer warehouses that have convenient access to distribution, are in a good spot. And the data centers and life science spaces, which have not much alternative use, but very robust demand for them, given the environment that we're in and all the trends that have been going on before COVID, but were accelerated. One of the other things I wanted to mention is that a reminder that we're reassessing the south and the west suburbs this year with COVID included, and we will make adjustments to Chicago and the North Triad were merited by the impact. So what we do is we talk about all the factors that we just discussed. We look at the magnitude of impact to these different classes of property. But then we also have to compare them in Chicago and the North suburbs to the starting position of those assessments. Was the starting position of those assessments accurate, high, low to begin with? That's another factor. And I think that's an important way to segue into the sales ratio study that we just completed. So this was done, the sales ratio study basically looks at all the transactions that took place in a year, and then compares those transactions to how did the assessor's office do in estimating the value of these properties. And this is sort of the acid test for how an assessment system is doing. The sales ratio study was done by the International Association of Assessing Officers, which is the gold standard in this world. They basically convene all the expertise of the assessors around the world. They know best practices, and so they really looked at all the transactions that took place in 2018 on the eve of us taking office. Now, why is that information on 2018 meaningful? Because it gives us a sense of how accurate were those assessments for the city of Chicago coming into our COVID adjustment and reassessment cycle next year. You probably saw that. If you didn't see the sales ratio study itself, you should. I think Scott will publish a link here in the chat box. It was covered in the front page of the Tribune, and it reinforced a lot of things that a lot of us knew, but again, it provided it with a level of detail and granularity and force of data that had not been provided before. It looked at several thousand transactions that took place in 2018. And it found out, it showed that commercial assessments overall were about 40% below transaction values. The market values of the commercial assessments were about 40% below where properties actually transacted in the county as a whole. And they were about 50% of transaction values in the city of Chicago. And further than that, it showed that smaller properties tended to be much more dramatically assessed closer to market value than the larger properties. And it showed that commercial properties in the neighborhoods were much more likely to be assessed closer to the mark than the ones downtown. And so this is important information for us to know as we go into looking for making COVID adjustments. So for example, public markets in retail show when we did our cutoff in April, it showed that the public market impact to retail from COVID was on the order of magnitude of somewhere around 20 or 30%. And so the sales ratio study showed that retail properties in some of the outlying neighborhoods were assessed at close to their transaction prices. So in that case, a COVID adjustment is merited, because if they were assessed pretty close to the mark before COVID and the public markets are showing, and all the other measures of value that we have, from appraisals to looking at market activity to all the other drivers that we can see, if that was having an effect of somewhere in the neighborhood of 20 or 30%, then an adjustment on those retail properties is merited. But on the other hand, if big properties are underassessed by 50%, there's no public market indication or other indication that we have that the COVID impact would be 50% or greater on the value of classes of commercial property. So that is what we have to consider in whether we apply a COVID adjustment or not. So we looked at the starting position of where assessments were pre-COVID. We have all these indications of the impact of COVID on different classes of real estate, and if the valuation versus where market values was pre-COVID is small enough so that there wasn't much difference, then we can apply a COVID adjustment to it. But if the properties already seem to be very underassessed, and that difference is greater than the impact of COVID, then that's where an indication where we probably won't make a COVID adjustment. The hardest part is that our data is not as granular as we would like it. A lot of the asset classes that we use in our assessment system don't perfectly conform with the asset classes that the public that markets would use. All the market operators that are on the call here today. And the second part is that the system, even for different classes of property, was pretty widely varying, which can be an indication of the quality of work done by the previous administration, but can also just show that our data on some of these properties is not that good, and we need to do a better job of getting data. So that's the sales ratio study. How do we get better at this? How can we take into account, first of all, the impact of COVID on the different classes of property that gives us more information than what we already have? And then how can we make the system work better? So to that first question, how do we get better indications of what's happening because of COVID to different kinds of properties in a way that's richer than what we already have? We are leaning heavily on the real property income and expense form. That's that commercial data platform that I talked about at the start of the call that we launched in February. And that gives commercial properties a chance to submit information to us before we've started the assessment process about the situation of rent collections and rent alterations and occupancy and all the different factors that enter into value. Every single commercial property in South Cook got a code so that they could fill out the RPIE before we assess them this year. We will send out an RPIE code to everyone in Chicago for the 2021 reassessment, and I encourage everyone to take advantage of it, because the way things have been done for a long time in our assessment system is really imperfect. The assessor's office would come up with the assessed value that was probably off because we didn't have enough data to make a good valuation judgment. Then the property owner pays a lawyer to clarify the starting point of the data. And then there's all this uncertainty for how that all shakes out in our assessment. When you appeal to our office now, you have to fill out the RPIE anyway. So why not fill out the RPIE in advance, get the best data to us in advance, so you don't have to pay the costs of fixing discrepancies in our data, to being able to show what's going on with the status of the property now based on conditions of COVID. Have that submitted to us in advance so you don't pay the cost of fixing it through the appeals process, and you don't have the uncertainty. You don't lose any of the rights to appeal that everyone has. And of course, everyone will try to make the best case for their valuation, but at least why not have the best data in our hands so that you save money and time and trouble at the outset, which can make many different things having to do with underwriting and investing and for all your tenants work better. So wanted to highlight that to everyone. This is a very important piece of the process. The real property income and expense form, for those of you who remember our work on the data modernization bill that was passed out of the Senate by bipartisan supermajorities before the House. Now, the RPIE is basically the building block that everyone would be required to fill out for the 30,000 or so commercial properties in Cook that it would apply to. Larger commercial properties. It will be done on an anonymized basis, and it again gives us the best information. So that especially for those small businesses whose properties are different from the data that we have in our databases, which kind of overrepresent the larger businesses, let's make sure that we have the right expense ratios and occupancies and rent levels for those kinds of properties that are more appropriate to those kinds of properties than the more generic ones that we have from the databases that we subscribe to. So that's RPIE. How else are we improving the assessment process? First of all, we've really added in a lot of new data sources. When I spoke to you last year, we talked about how we'd added in TREP, which gives us a whole new view into the commercial mortgage-backed security market, the bond market, which has that really helpful information about mortgages and the appraisals submitted with mortgages in public vehicles. We talked about how we'd added in some other data sources. Well, this year we beefed it up even more. We have several new, very rich databases that we brought in, from Bloomberg to Reese to databases that give us more insight on leases that are being signed, and also, really incorporating a lot of the work from the commercial brokers out there, incorporating their cap rate and rent surveys more richly into our system. So data sources is one. We've been doing lots of hiring. We've had really good support from the county following on our process audit done by the IAAO, which showed that we needed to beef up our analysts, our analyst corpus, as well as our group of folks out there gathering information from the field. So what have we done? We've hired a lot of people at the management level who have private sector experience as appraisers or lenders. And also we've hired people who have run big assessors offices around the country. Our chief valuations officer, we're very proud of, he ran Lake County's, so he was the assessor of Lake County. We brought in the former assessor of Philadelphia. We brought in people from other places who are really good at some of the guts of implementing new IT systems and having good operational processes so that we can meet the national standards that we should and that everyone has a right to expect from us. We also have been beefing up our data science operation. When we came into office, we created a data science department. We've been adding new data scientists and new staff there to build it up at the civil service level, and we've been adding new tools for the public to use. We're really excited about some new tools we'll be introducing in the next 2 quarters that are an outgrowth of that data science work. We have been doing more training of our staff to improve their productivity and capabilities. We're getting more outside advice too from groups like you, and we'll continue to do that. We're proud to have some announcements soon on that score. Lastly, we've been really working hard to give you tools as an outgrowth of all this work so that you can invest and underwrite better. Last year, we had our first market analyst day where we brought the city's CFO and the mayor together with our valuation department and our data science department. And the city gave us information about the outlook for levies. You'll remember we don't have any involvement with setting taxes at our office. We're just estimating the value of properties so that we can all divvy up the tax burden that's determined by others, like the city. We brought the city in to give us an outlook for their levies, because that's one key piece in projecting rates, which is ultimately what you guys care about. So we gave you information and top-level people to get a sense of what the potential outlooks for levies are. And then we gave you a sense for, hey, here's where we think the starting point of assessments is, and here's how we're doing assessments. So you can project how the base can change when we reassess Chicago. And then we gave you a tool so that you could do rate scenarios, and that helps people to underwrite better. And we've gotten really great feedback from people who are doing investments with that, but also people who are doing market research. And we have several of the most capable folks doing market research who've already published reports or will be publishing reports to help people understand what the impact of some of these changes is. I think a key theme is that a lot of people don't understand that the way our system works, rates float. You have a levy, which is a lump sum of dollars, spread across an assessed value base. And if the levy changes or the assessed value base changes, the rate changes. Our rates are not fixed here. And so that tool can really help people understand, okay, if the assessed value base is growing by this much, my assessment might change by this much, and the levy is going to change by this much, here's what could happen to the rate. It's a very important tool. I think what we saw in the north suburbs last year with our reassessment is that people who saw their assessment go up a lot saw their taxes change by a much smaller amount, sometimes going in the opposite direction. And that's because our rates float. The rates fell in just about every single township of the northern triad of Cook County because the base was changing. We were writing a lot of those corrections mentioned in the sales ratio study, but the levies weren't changing as much, so the rates fell. This is very important to understand for anyone investing and making investment decisions. We've provided that tool last year. We will have a market analyst day this year where we'll provide even richer rate scenario and analysis tools. We'll give you more information that will help you to make projections on the size of the assessed value base in Chicago. And we'll also release some of the basic valuation assumptions that we'll be using in assessing commercial property in Chicago. We hope that this will improve certainty and predictability and underwriting in Chicago in conditions that we know are very difficult. And so I know we're about to start Q&A. I think the last thing I'd like to mention before we go into that is that it's become a commonplace that COVID has sort of accelerated changes that were underway already. And this is very true of the world of real estate. And I think it's highlighting a real problem with how our property tax system works. People think because I'm the assessor that I like property taxes. I don't. I think there are a lot of problems with how they work, and it's becoming increasingly inappropriate in terms of how much burden it takes on at a time when bricks and mortar in general is under more pressure. So the property tax system evolved out of the way wealth was in our economy before the 21st century. Almost all wealth was in the form of your house, your land, and your physical capital. The economy has changed so much since then. The growth of the service economy, the growth of the financial economy, the growth of the tech economy, the growth of the healthcare economy have become huge. They've become a huge part of the economy, yet they occupy hardly any physical footprint. And yet, so wealth is, real estate as a share of total wealth is much lower, and yet real estate still has to shoulder all the burdens of financing our education system and local services. And this might have been a tolerable thing in past decades, but I think COVID, because it's accelerating this change, think about, we're doing this call on Zoom, think about all the Amazon purchases we're doing, think of all the other things that are sort of eating away at the base of our real estate value, while it's expected to carry the costs of financing our education system. And I'm really worried that if this trend continues without us finding alternative ways to get financing for our school system, that it's going to cause more inequity, it's going to cause more segregation, it's going to cause more investment to crowd in some areas to the exclusion of others. And so it's so important that we, as people who care about physical places, about the vitality of places like downtown and the neighborhoods that make it special, that we raise our voices to say, hey, we need to find alternative ways to finance education, because education is the majority of property taxes, 2/3 of property taxes. We need to find other state levers and federal levers to carry more of the cost of financing schools, so that the ever narrowing shoulders of our physical brick and mortar communities don't have to bear that burden and feel the cost. It creates an equitable outcome. So I just thought I'd leave it there. And just, you know, we should all be raising our voices on this, because our livelihoods and the things that we love depend on having a healthy physical environment. So with that, let's go to questions.
Thank you, Assessor. That was a lot of really great information. And I think your last point is certainly something that CCAC membership and the executive committee, you know, can really explore. So I do encourage the members to use the Q&A button. Indicate if you would like for me to try to get you live on camera in order to ask your question, or if you'd like me to relay your question. So please use the Q&A button. And I know you may have already covered this, but one of our members submitted a question early on, and I'm going to do my best to bring him on screen. So I am just looking for Kent Swanson. Bear with me. Here we go. So,
Kent.
Yeah, great. So
Kent was there last year.
Let's hope that this works. So Kent, you are muted, but if you could unmute, there you go. Excellent.
So yeah, I think you did cover parts of my question. I was kind of getting after the issue of all the different commercial properties have had such different effects on them, And you hit on that with, data centers being winners and, retail and hotel really being, just, really, really devastated by COVID. And I think maybe I put it a little different way than I kind of really phrased the question to Kelly. And really, I think, we're seeing, at least what I see in terms of, values and things that are occurring in the market is that if you have a long-term lease with a strong credit tenant and that is kind of an unassailable kind of a position, that the value of that thing is now maybe even somewhat higher because the risk-free rate is lower and that cap rate might have even dropped a little bit. Whereas if you have any kind of hotel asset or any kind of retail asset where you have long-term issues, or you've got, vacancy where tenants are declaring bankruptcy, you've got, no restaurants that are paying any rent right now, or many of them are not paying rent because they're having a very difficult time operating. How are you looking at vacancy, credit, and lease term where you've got McDonald's having their headquarters selling at a very robust number, a near record-setting number, but a lot of other things just hit so hard, and that a lot of that is really not real estate. It's much more financial value, not real estate value.
Great question, Kent. So, our job is to put ourselves in the feet of a buyer of a structure and separate that from the business going on inside it. So, two identical buildings next to each other, which have different lease structures inside of them. Say one has net leases, one has gross leases, one has leases that were signed last year, one has leases that were signed 3 years ago. Both building owners have a right to be assessed in the same way. We should not be valuing those buildings differently, even if one might have a richer set of leases and transfer of risk inside of it than the other. So we really try to strip out for example, if someone is paying something for leases in place that don't reflect current market conditions, we have to discount. We have to look at, okay, if this building was getting market terms that were in place today, what would be its earning power, rather than to value leases that no longer reflect market terms. So that's something that we have to always be mindful of. On the other hand, we don't want to anchor onto 1 year's worth of experience. If a reasonable buyer would, if a property is entirely vacant today, they wouldn't assume it's entirely vacant into the future. They would look at its earning power over time. And so we have to take account of that too. I think what I'd encourage you to look at, Kent, is we published our vacancy policy back in May, where we talk about how we weigh the impact of vacancy. I think additionally with new buildings that are coming in, we build in a phase in of occupancy into it. So that's another factor to bear in mind. You can look at, for example,
I have one of those, so thank you.
Yeah, so I hear. One of the things I'd encourage you to look at is when we reassessed Oak Park this year, there are some buildings that were recently constructed that are building occupancy, and you can see that there's only a partial assessment in place for them. So that's how we think about it. We never want to anchor onto a transaction that might have unique things going on that don't necessarily reflect the market. We want to take into account the full pattern of information that any buyer, reasonable buyer would. That's sort of the North Star for us, is like, what would a buyer, taking into account all the information that they have today, assuming mortal powers of an average human, what could they expect to generate in terms of earning power from the building? COVID is challenging because we can look at this in terms of several different perspectives, and we kind of have to weigh them all. The public market perspective is valuable because it kind of rolls in everything. Like, if you have a REIT, an office REIT, how it was trading pre-COVID and then post-COVID, that's the public market saying, when we roll in all the future uncertainty, all the vacancy, all the potential change in leases, all the change in cap rates, here's the magnitude of change. So that's one perspective. It's not perfect. Another perspective is we can build it from the bottom up. We can, using models, look at, okay, here's the change in rent rate, here's the change in occupancy, here's the change in cap rate. And we can make sure that we're trying not to double count things. We can incorporate it that way, using an appraisal point of view. But we will try to incorporate all those perspectives.
Great.
Thank you. And thank you so much, Ken, for submitting your question. So I do invite the audience to, again, use the Q&A button if you have any questions for the assessor. And I guess, Kent, I can try to turn off your camera, and I can find how to make you not a panelist anymore. So sorry about that. It just takes a few seconds here. But while I'm doing that, I wonder, Assessor, if you could answer a question regarding your experience working with your colleagues around the country. Do you have any place that you would point to, other cities that you would consider kind of best in practice, where you think they're kind of doing it right, and where you want to see the office as it continues to evolve with your leadership?
Sure. I think there are different bits of pieces of many different systems that we like to borrow from. If we were to pick one that seems to get the most praise, or overall like a high grade from people, we hear from we hear about several different jurisdictions in Northern Virginia and Washington, D.C. When we talk to highly respected commercial market participants here in Chicago and elsewhere, we've heard people mention that several times. And then when we talk to them, we sort of see why people say that. But there are, New York and Boston and Washington are really good at sort of collecting the kind of commercial data that you need, and having a good framework for taking in at the top of the funnel commercial data, which is addressing one of the biggest problems we have, because we don't get just sort of the basic guts of some of the things that we need to value commercial property. So we look to them for that. It's not a walk on the beach in those places and other aspects of their assessment system. We wouldn't want to emulate some of the ways that they do assessments in New York. They have caps on residential assessments that create a lot more inequity, for example. So it's not, that's not perfect. We really like the way King County, which is where Seattle does, gives data to users so that you can underwrite well, and then also look at neighborhoods, and people who are promoting investment in neighborhoods can use all this rich data that they have. King County is really good at that. They've got a really good interface. Maricopa County, which is one of the biggest counties in the United States, it's where the greater Phoenix area is. They're really good at using technology in the field to make sure that they've got a really good census of the buildings and are tracking changes. That's important to all of us so that everyone's only paying their fair share. And we look to them for some of the technological ways they use technology. This is another big area of problem for us. On the commercial side, we have problems getting like the right kind of market data about incomes and expenses, using the right cap rates, especially on smaller properties that are less efficient and have higher expenses, lower rents that are out in the neighborhoods. Like, that's one of the big problems in commercial data for us. Residential data, it's just getting a proper census of all the buildings. And so we look to Maricopa County on that. We think Los Angeles is really good at training people and helping people understand the system and navigate it. We brought into our communication staff a person who was at the Los Angeles Assessor's Office, and
Excellent.
did a tour there.
I see
really
one
good
of
training.
our members, I'm sorry to interrupt. I see one of our members has raised his hand, Steve Byfield. So I don't know if that means he has a question, but I'm going to promote him to a panelist, and he can let us know if he does have a question.
Right.
So, Steve, you're muted. Do you have a question for the assessor? Steve Byfield. Hey, Steve, welcome.
Hi, how are you?
Excellent. Thank you
Hi.
for joining us.
Actually, I always type better than I speak, so I'll try and rephrase what I said. We're seeing apartment rents get crushed in the city and the near neighborhoods. West Loop now, our competition is offering 3 months of free rent. We're seeing effective rents on our buildings at levels that we haven't seen for almost 6 or 7 years. And of course, you know, with rising real estate taxes, the combination is terrible for us. The Milwaukee Road Corridor, similar thing, 2 to 3 months. We have a couple projects in this up, and we've had lower rents, 8 to 10%. We are adding more concessions just because the coronavirus is, you know, people aren't getting out and checking out projects and doing tours and the like. So we're, you know, we realize retail and hotels have been crushed, but us in the apartment industry are being impacted pretty badly as well. And I guess 2 questions. One is how will you account for concessions which don't show up in rent rolls, because you just get a rent roll that shows the apartment's leased at a certain rate, even though the first couple months they may have paid nothing. And secondly, how is the city going to adjust if all these properties, commercial and residential income properties, have seen their incomes decline so dramatically without you lowering assessed values and then tax rates going up dramatically to offset that? So,
Great question, Steve. First of all, we want to make sure that we are getting the right all-in rent information when we're valuing apartments. We know how important that is. So what I'd ask you to do is, I don't know if you've looked at our real property income and expense form. We're trying to ask about all the different concessions that you are providing. What I'd ask you to do is to take a look at it and then see what we're not asking about, because you will quickly get a sense of, hey, you didn't ask about this thing, which I know is an impairment to value. Because we are redesigning, you know, right now the form that we use for the RPIE for next year. We think we've caught a lot of the concessions in there in terms of the, you know, the things that impair the income value of the building to you, but we always are all ears in terms of making sure, and when we know markets evolve, so we always want to make sure that we're taking the pulse of people. We've tried to ask different market participants about this, but my team is at your disposal. So once you've looked at the RPIE, you can write to me at fritz@cookcountyassessor.com or write to A. Miller at cookcountyassessor.com. He's our head of commercial assessments, just to make sure that we're asking the right things about that. So we want to make sure we're getting the rental collection, you know, the net rental collection side right. You know, that is one factor which will drive down valuations. The countervailing factor is that the assessor's office before was using double-digit cap rates to value apartments, and I think you know that the market, it's hard to find a double-digit cap rate in the apartment market out there. So we're going to try to use a representative cap rate for the class of apartment that we're looking at. One of the other most important things, and this especially applies to some apartment buildings, is that we want to make sure we have the cost ratios right for the kind of building we're looking at. This is one of the areas where we really need to improve. We have through TREP, which has you know, pretty rich data on larger multifamily buildings that are financed through CMBS. We have a pretty good sense of cost ratios for buildings like that, and we have a pretty good sense of what's happening to rental collections and changes in rents from the buildings that are in the CMBS world. These are higher level institutional buildings. We can see that on a quarterly basis. What our radar does not pick up is that 100-year-old 20-unit courtyard building, walk up, no AC in the neighborhoods. Those expense ratios are different, not professionally managed, not sweating the assets in the same way. we want to make sure we're seeing what's going on there too. For example, in our single family assessment methodology, we also assess 2 to 6 flats sort of in the same way we do single family. We don't use the income approach. We have enough transactions to do it just based on sales comparables. We know from talking to DePaul Housing Institute that those 2 to 6 flats are disproportionately hit versus single family in down cycles because those tenants are marginal. It's typically not professionally run, typically maybe not people who are working in the official labor sector. So, we did make a larger adjustment to those kinds of apartment buildings to 2 to 6 flats than for single family based on COVID, based on what we saw in April. But we will follow the data, Steve, wherever it is. We want to make sure we're asking the right things about what's happening with rents, and we want to make sure we have that comprehensive view. And we're all ears for other suggestions or recommendations. You got my email, fritz@cookcountyassessor.com.
Great. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. And I see that we are at 1 o'clock, which usually when we are meeting in person, we try to wrap up no later than 1:30. But now that we're virtual, we're trying to hit the 1 o'clock mark. So I guess I'll just ask one last time. Does anybody have an urgent question that they want to ask the assessor? Okay, so again, if you use the Q&A button, I will make sure that any questions that are submitted after we sign off, we can relay to the office. I hope.
Can I sort of grab a little bit of soapbox here before we close?
Okay, certainly.
So I close saying that COVID is sort of exposing the inequity of the property tax system in terms of bricks and mortar having to shoulder the whole costs of paying for our education system, and this is. There are really 2 ways to solve that. Is the state going to help provide more support for financing schools, or the federal government? The state, as we know, has got a lot of problems. Anything that it can do in changing its funding formula and funding capacity for schools will help reduce the load. But I think the real action is on the federal side. The federal government hasn't really done much of anything in the last few decades to advance federal aid for education. They spend about $15 billion on that. That is nothing. That's like the cost of 1 aircraft carrier. That's a fraction of what they spent in aiding the airlines just in the first couple of months of this year. If they doubled or tripled the amount of federal aid, so $15 billion is, federal government needs that for practice. They raise it to 30 or 45. That could be a double-digit decline in the levy by the CPS. I mean, this is not a lot of money, not a lot of. If the federal government just moves its toe a little bit on aid for federal education, it will make a big difference in terms of how the cost of education falls on everyone who owns property in Cook County, be it commercial or residential. And there's a real opportunity here. And we should all raise our voices and not lose sight of that. There's going to be a window to do this. And I think we should all take advantage when there's this awareness of economic change and disparate impact to say, hey, wait a second, shouldn't the federal government do a little bit more to educate, pay just a little bit more to educate our children? It's really that simple. I think it's a strong case. We all will benefit from it. So we should talk to our senators and our state rep and our congressmen. I think they're up to speed, but if we keep on mentioning it to them, they'll realize that, hey, this is something that everyone can agree on.
I think that's absolutely correct. And certainly everybody knows we have an election coming up in just a few weeks. And we, as an organization, would be delighted to continue this conversation and, maybe put together a task force to submit a proposal to the president, whichever side is whatever administration it might be, carrying forward what you just suggested and the inequities, and particularly, again, as our organization is looking at how different downtown is, it really speaks to a need to think holistically. So we would love to be able to work with you further, and for today to be just the beginning of that conversation.
We would really embrace that, and we look forward to it.
Excellent. Well, thank you for your time today, Assessor. We really appreciate your willingness to answer questions and to get us up to speed. It sounds like your office you've got the professionals that you need in place, and you are positioned to really respond to current situations. So with that, I want to thank the CCAC members for your continued support. Please watch your emails for our upcoming programming. Please email me if you'd like to get involved in any of our current initiatives, again, with the neighborhoods as well as with downtown. I appreciate you taking your time today. Thank you. Stay well, stay strong. I look forward to seeing you soon. Thank you.
Okay. Best wishes. Hope to see you guys in the flesh sometime soon.
And you have a great staff, by the way. I really enjoyed working with them, particularly Scott. Shout out to
Right back at you, Kelly. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, everybody. Have a great day.
Bye now.